comes from the Spirit with glorious light. Confident living cleanses my soul, giving the Spirit fullest control.
I'm Mike Costello, and I'd like to talk to you in the next few minutes about going with the flow. In New Thought metaphysical philosophy, we believe that we live in our minds and not in the world. All of us have experiences in this life. We all have jobs and families and opportunities to express ourselves in the physical world. But what really matters and what really creates the caliber of our life is what goes on in our minds. So by changing the way that we think, we can change the quality of our life. That's fundamental to metaphysical philosophy. In life, we all need to realize and understand that there are challenges and situations that will come into every life experience. It doesn't matter how well you are, how wealthy you are, how knowledgeable you are, all of us are faced with challenges. And the dealing with challenges is what really creates for us the meaning of life. We believe that life is an expression of learning, or a school, if you will, for the soul or for the spiritual being. And so in that process, we cultivate a process of mind control and mind awareness that aligns our mind with the mind of God. As we align our mind or our thinking with the mind and thought of God, then we're able to access the limitless potential of universal love and light and awareness. We're told that if a swimmer is caught in a riptide and the tide is taking him or her out to sea, the best thing to do is to relax and go with it, to go with the tide that's pulling them away until they reach a point in time where there isn't the resistance and they're able to come back to the shore, or in some circumstances, to simply let it carry them out and then allow it to carry them back in. It's a very difficult concept if you're a swimmer and you're being pulled out to sea. The same situation applies to the circumstances and situations of life. When you're faced with a challenge, with a difficulty, with limited economic resources, when your relationships are going sour, when you're having difficulty with your job or your neighbors or your families, we all find ourselves in these riptide situations. And it's very difficult for us to accept the fact that we need to go with the flow. We need to allow life to carry us along, even if it's carrying us in what appears to be a negative, painful, or hurtful direction. But as we're able to embrace this concept of going with the flow of life, we learn that as we release the control that we believe we have on life, as we release our mind and our worries and our thoughts, as we connect our mind with the power and the grace of God, then we are directed in ways that we should go and things that we should do. There are many things in our lives that are beyond our control. You and I and all of us in this human condition will experience a myriad of circumstances and situations that are beyond our control. We can control certain things, but many others we can't. Some people think that there are two ways to deal with negative experiences in life: simply accepting it and saying whatever will be, or resisting it and fighting it. But I'd like to submit to you that there is another way, a more positive way, and a way that can guide you and direct you into a more peaceful life, into a more prosperous life, and into a more centered life. And that is going with the flow, accepting the fact that there is divine order, that there is universal love, that there is the power and grace of God that will direct and guide your life and bring you to the action, bring you to the decisions, and bring you to the change of mind that you need in the midst of your difficulty or your problems. So we have to invite ourselves to go with the flow. And when we say go with the flow, we're not talking about simply giving up and saying, oh, well, this is just what I have to deal with in life, and passively allowing the circumstance or situation to beat us up. What we're talking about is not giving up, but giving in, giving consent, giving our assent to the fact that this is the way that it is, and then asking divine intelligence and the Spirit of God to guide and direct us in what we should do. If you look at your checkbook and there isn't enough money, you have a couple of options. You can look at your checkbook and see that there isn't enough money to meet your obligations and go deep into depression and feel sad and put upon, or you can open yourself to the reality that prosperity and abundance is your right, and that if you connect with the divine spirit and power and mind of God, you will be guided and directed in ways that can bring you to prosperity. If you face an illness, You face the illness. It is a reality, just as that economic challenge is a reality. But as you face it, you have a choice in terms of how it is you respond to it, how it is you feel about it, and how it is you think about it. And if you simply learn and cultivate the technique of going with the flow, not simply passively giving up and not resisting and fighting, but opening yourself to be guided and directed in ways that you would never have developed or come to know on your own. A number of years ago in Unity magazine, there was a story titled A Dog Named Peppy. And it was a story about a lady who had been married to a gentleman for a number of years, and they had a 17-year-old poodle. And the poodle was very old at 17 and had become a wonderful part of their family. And the poodle was unusually attached to her husband. It was really her husband's dog. And because of its advanced years, it was deaf and it was blind. But because it understood its environment, because it knew the house, and because especially it knew him, that dog was able to function at a very high level, just as if it had sight and hearing. And the dog would even sense when her husband was in the room. And her husband would take the dog for walks and play with the dog, and the dog had adjusted magnificently and wonderfully to the difficulties that it was facing in the end of its life with the challenges that it had. But something happened that altered the life of the dog, the life of the husband, and the life of the wife. The husband died unexpectedly. The wife had known the dog for 17 years, but she had no bonding, no relationship with it. More importantly, her entire life had collapsed. Her husband was the breadwinner of the family. She had not worked for many, many years, so she had no ability to make money, to have a job. She didn't work. They had obligations. Their house wasn't paid for. She had limited resources, and by the time she paid for the funeral, there was no money. And so in that circumstance and situation, she had the option of looking at how it was she was going to deal with these circumstances and situations. Was she going to be able to take care of Peppy and bond with him? Was she going to be able to deal with her financial difficulties? Was she going to lose her house? Was she going to simply give in to this situation, wring her hands and talk about, isn't it awful? Or was she going to whine and whimper about it and share that information with her friends? Or, more importantly, and the choice that she made was that she was going to go with the flow. She wasn't happy that her husband had passed away, but she knew that her husband passing away was a natural part of life. She wasn't happy that he had passed away at this point in time, but she knew that there was infinite intelligence and limitless potential. And she knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that the power and grace of God could guide and direct her and take care of her. So she got busy and she went to school. She borrowed some money. She was able to keep her house payments up while she trained to have a job. She established a relationship with Peppy. And after 6 months, she was able to get a job, not living as she had lived before, but able to meet her obligations. She was happy and she was peaceful. She chose to deal with the negative experiences of life in a positive and uplifting way. She learned through the teaching of metaphysics and New Thought philosophy to go with the flow. She learned that difficulties come to all of us, and that the difficulties don't need to control us, that the way that we respond to them and the way that we think about them determines the quality of our life. She chose to connect herself, her mind, with the mind of God. She chose to give up negative thinking. She chose to give up the ain't it awful philosophy, the wringing of the hands, and all of the other thoughts that many people have when they're faced with adversity or difficulty. And in the process, she was guided to do the things that she needed to do because her husband was gone. Nothing was going to change that. Peppy was there. Nothing is going to change that. Her limited economic resources are as they are. She knew that she had to act and react, and she knew that she would be guided and directed. We need to know that when we go with the flow, when we go with the flow of life, we will be guided to do what is needed. We will be guided and directed in ways that we would never have imagined. And we need to know with the assurance that she had that the power and grace of God will touch our lives and bring us to an understanding of clarity, of action, of peace, and of centering. We believe in prayer as a centering force. We believe in prayer as a way to heal and align ourselves with the power and presence of God. We'd like to invite you at this point in the program to pause for a moment of reflection with us. Eternal and loving God, we gather our hearts and minds together in the need that we have to go with the flow of life. And we don't ask that circumstances or situations be changed or that difficulties be removed from us, but instead we ask that we would be guided and directed and assured to go with the natural flow of life, to connect ourselves with your infinite intelligence, and to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that your power and grace is inflowing into our minds, our hearts, and our lives now and always. We know these things in the name of faith, in the name of hope, in the name of love. Amen.
Those were wonderful analogies of going with the flow, and the explanation that when we go with the flow, we're going with the course of nature.
Right. We eliminate the resistance issue. And so often when we have negative experiences, we begin by resisting it. And if we begin by resisting, then we set up a stage for conflict, for stress, and for fighting.
Yes.
Yeah.
Jesus told us to resist not evil. And sometimes we get confused on that, but it just means negativity instead of evil.
Mm-hmm.
And that if we then don't resist, then we do exactly what you said, go with the flow.
Yeah. The story about Pepe I thought was so good because, of course, she had no relationship with Pepe. And of course, Pepe was just one of the many things that she had to deal with. But this woman, who was, of course, a student of metaphysics, a true student and a unity student, understood the principles. And so when she wrote this article, she wrote it for the benefit of those who hadn't understood the teaching before. Mm-hmm. And for many people, our teaching or philosophy is totally alien. Yeah. And I think one of the purposes of our program is to allow us to tell people that metaphysical philosophy and New Thought philosophy is certainly, from our perspective, a Christian influence, but it is a different interpretation of that influence. And it offers a positive and logical alternative.
Yes, and it offers a way of life that is totally different from just giving up or being over-aggressive. The routine things that we're taught in school and that we're taught in life that in our culture so often, to be aggressive, overly so, and so forth. And if we're just going with the flow, then we're doing both, but we're doing it well.
We're doing it extremely well. A good example that's biblical that people can relate to is the story of Job.
Yeah.
And of course, we all know that story, and unfortunately, most traditionalists pull out some of the most horrific things of that story. And one of the things that they pull out is, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away, blessed be the name of the Lord forever. And it's kind of beat my chest, and it's awful, but God wanted to do it. And so often at funerals, we hear traditional clergymen and clergy persons who will use that reference. And of course, God has no desire at all for any negativity in our life. And the story of Job is really not one of the negativity that he experienced, but if we read that entire book, it's really the way that he overcame negativity.
Yes.
And he moved from that thought. And I'm sure the lady that wrote the article about Pepe may have thought, well, this is what God wants for me. Yeah. But if we read farther, we see that the people who came to talk to Job, which we believe is a metaphysical interpretation of what he dealt with inside his heart and his mind, told him, you know, God didn't will this. Yes. God doesn't will negativity. And that's another issue, that God's will doesn't change. And somehow we've come to believe that God's will changes, that it's God's will that my wife or my husband is dead. It's God's will that I have cancer. It's God's will that that we have violence because evil and good are fighting, or some other kind of idea or thought. And in fact, God never changes. God is constant love and constant acceptance. And God created us and placed us in this earth experience, and then he left it to us. And so it is those of us who are in this physical experience who are having spiritual lessons that are truly expressing the power and grace of God. And God's will doesn't change. God loves us all. So.
That wondrous plan of God to give us free will has given us lots of problems, because we do have free will, but how do we use it? And so often we misuse it. And if we can just say, not my will, but thine be done, O God, in me and through me, and positively live that, then we are living according to God's will in a positive way. But too often, through our self-will and being too willful, we create problems for ourselves.
Right. Important that we share, again, in New Thought and metaphysical philosophy, that personal responsibility is preeminently important.
Yes.
And that is that certainly we have a choice. And the choice is always ours to be either positive or negative, to either, as I said in the little talk that we just shared, either resist it or say, oh my goodness, I'm beat down and I'm lost. What am I going to do? Or we can say, what am I going to do? And then get up and do it.
Exactly.
Which is very important.
Yes.
The fact is that God will give us the inspiration to do what we need to do, but God expects us to do it.
To do it.
Then this idea of let go and let God, We need to let go and let God and then be directed to act.
Yes, your analogy in the beginning of your talk was wonderful in that respect, that in many respects, but in that respect, it said, relax and go with the flow, and then you'll be able to get back to shore. But if you fight too hard while the flow is too strong against you, then your energy is spent and you don't have the strength to get back to shore.
Or if you prepare for your funeral,
Right.
then it's over. And so I think those are important distinctions. But the real conditioning comes in cultivating the way that we think. And I think that's what our listeners need to understand. And that's what our primary function in our churches, in our fellowships, is to help people. I mean, we do all kinds of things. We teach people all kinds of things. But we really need to fundamentally teach them how it is they need to deal with the practical problems of life.
Exactly.
And this whole philosophy is directed to the practical philosophy of living life in its mundane, usual, ordinary way. And, you know, the very high mountaintop experiences and the metaphysical experiences and the spiritual experiences that people have are wonderful and good, but we live our lives in the experience of daily living. We live our lives getting up, dealing with our families, dealing with the economic situations, dealing with our spiritual growth, and that's really where the lessons come in.
Exactly. And if we can remember what you just said, self-responsibility, we won't expect God to do everything for us, knowing that that's why we're here on earth, to take charge.
Exactly. And as we go into that philosophy, we need to make clear that so many detractors who dislike our philosophy of theology and religion say that we're really taking away the power of God because God can do this or God can do that, God can do anything. But in fact, we're saying that God has done everything.
Exactly.
And so it isn't that we're taking anything away from God, nor are we negating what he or she is. We're simply saying that God's abundant supply of knowledge and of strength and of health and of prosperity and all of our needs have been given to us. And as we connect with that divine presence, we'll be able to deal with it. It doesn't mean, and some people have used metaphysics in a very different way, to make people believe that we can cure all illnesses, that we can all be rich and we have a right to do that. And those are principles that can be applied, and certainly they have a part in life. But in fact, there are so many more things of life that we need to understand. In an illness, it's not so important that the illness be healed as it is important that the person be healed.
Exactly.
And that people understand that they, in their spirit, in their soul, are not sick,
Yes.
that their bodies are sick. And so it is a detachment, and we're constantly learning to detach from life. I mean, God, in his infinite intelligence and wisdom, brings us wrinkles and makes us old to remind us that we're moving along.
Yes.
And he's kind of telling us, come on, get on with life. And that's exactly what we need to do. We need to embrace that idea and concept.
Yes. I think the ideas of the East are becoming more and more prevalent in the West. And in the East, they taught the art of dying. I'm rereading a book, the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, by Sogyal Rinpoche, and it brings home very strongly the fact that they do teach us that, and they teach that they've taught it in the East for years, and there needs to be the merging of the East and the West, and there is. Not just needs to be, but it's happening.
It's happening because of the information age and
Yes.
because of the transportation that we have, and no power on earth can stop it.
Yes.
And I think that it is just happening at the right time by divine appointment, because we're moving into a new age of enlightenment and understanding, and nothing is going to stop that. And so as the East comes to the West, and the West learns that it doesn't have all the answers,
Yes.
and that it's truly not right on every point. And really, when we look at philosophy and theology, no one is right on all of
Exactly.
the points that we all believe that we are. But in fact, we have a long period of evolution, and we need to be open and aware of the fact that God speaks to all of us at different levels and different levels of need.
Yes, and we need that blending of the East and the West, the knowledge and the wisdom of the East and the West, and that's how we're growing. But we've reached the time in our evolutionary journey, which I know that you feel is true, that it's time for this. Everything is timing, and it's in God's own divine timing. We've come to that point in our evolution where it's time for us to learn these truths and live them.
It's an ebb and a flow.
Yes.
And all of life is an ebb and a flow, and it's been ebbing and flowing and continues to bring us to this point.
Yes, and it's a wonderful thing if we can know that and teach it and help others to live more fully. That's your talk was just wonderful in that respect, because it shows how if we resist, then we're not going to do very well. If we give up, we're not doing well at all. So, and it all depends on the individual.
You know, one of the things that we say is that metaphysical interpretation teaches us, and you spoke to this when we first began our discussion, that evil, and certainly we have all kinds of ideas about what evil is, and the churches have really convinced us so much of what evil is and what Satan is. But if we take evil and we simply use it and change the words to error thought,
Yeah.
then the wrong thinking, it's simply the wrong way of thinking about something, then the whole context changes. And you use the scripture that Jesus said, resist not evil, resist not the wrong thinking, and that wrong thinking will take care of itself.
Yes.
Because as people embrace that negativity, they become destroyed by it until they come to a point of understanding the reality that there's another way, that
Yes.
there's another clear way.
Yes.
And so we don't need to fight to overcome Satan, or we don't need to undo evil. Evil will undo itself. What we need to do is align ourselves with the power and the grace of God.
And when we feel comfortable and we're going with the flow, then we know that we're on the right track. Is that what you would say?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then when we're on the right track, then we are open and receptive to the power and grace of God that will come in and guide us and direct us. And we can all identify with the fact that when we have a difficult problem or something that problem we're trying to solve, we can study, we can meditate, we can talk to people, we can read, we can do any number of things to try to get the solution. And usually the solution comes when we're washing the dishes, when we're standing in the shower, when we're driving the car, when our mind gets out of the way.
Yeah.
And we're working on something else. And then the power of God's mind, infinite intelligence and divine mind, as we call it, divine mind connects with our mind, and then an explosive thing happens. Then we know what to do.
When we're doing humble and mundane things, the rich, rewarding experience occurs. Isn't that lovely?
Yeah.
It's so interesting to know that you teach so often living in the now. When we're living in the now, we're going with the flow. When we're living in the now, we're not looking at the past. We're not dreading the future nor fearing the future, but just being in the present.
Tremendously important. And one of the things that we talk about so often, and this lady with Pepe is a good example, where it's easy in adversity to go into the past and say, oh, I miss John and I miss our life, and to live in the past, or to be preoccupied with the future. And when we step into the past or we step into the future, we step out of the conscious moment and we literally cease to be conscious. And an example of that is that most of us can identify with who drive, is that we always get in our car, most of the time we get in our car and we start the engine and we go to where we need to go. If someone asks us to consciously tell them what color cars were around us, what streets we took, we aren't consciously driving. We are unconsciously driving. And as we're driving our car, we're thinking about where it is we're going, what it is we're going to do, and then miraculously we're there. So in the process of life, we have the same circumstance and situation, and we need to really be in the conscious moment. A good driver would really be conscious and aware of driving. It's only through God's grace and miracles that we're able to get where we need to go. But that is a problem, a real problem, to live in the now. And living in the now so often means, again, going back to this lady in the article, accepting things the way they are. Now, when we say accepting things the way that we aren't saying give in to them.
Yeah.
If someone has a diagnosis of cancer, one of the things, and I hear metaphysicians and New Thought people all the time say, don't say it. Don't give it strength. Don't deny it. And yet, if the person has cancer, it's all right to have cancer. Now the issue is, what do I do with this cancer? What do I do? And how is this cancer and this illness to relate to my life? And we know from metaphysical thought, we know from psychiatric care, we know from psychology, and we know from theology that even if we could cure that cancer, that the physical ailments of our life are manifested because something is going on in our spirit and in our mind. And if you cure that without curing the problem, without dealing with the problem, something else is going to come and it might be worse.
Yes.
So we think, oh, if we could get healed, and certainly we pray for healing, and we have some wonderful healings, and we promote that concept. But healing is not validated by the fact that everybody is touched and healed. It's validated so that people understand that the power of God can touch lives.
Yes. Well, they're not true. One is not truly healed until the illness is not capable of coming back again. They're totally. Sometimes it's in remission, and they think they're healed. It's in remission because they haven't been healed in body, in mind, and spirit, just only in body.
Yep.
which is another way of saying what you just said.
Another way. And then the other option is, and you've heard me say, tell this story so many times. Years ago, we had a couple in the church, and the husband had cancer. And he was a wonderful metaphysician, and he simply denied that he had cancer. He wouldn't agree that he had cancer, never had it treated, and in the end suffered tremendously in the last days and weeks of his life, but suffered in a very positive and beautiful way, because he knew that he was doing what he wanted to do and what he was guided to do. And in the end, he said, I don't have cancer. And of course, he died of cancer. And his wife was so worried about the fact that they hadn't followed the doctor's orders, that he had suffered so much in the end. And she questioned her faith. And he appeared to her in a dream. And he said, and this was several years later, and she wrote to tell me, she said, he came to me and he said, you need to remember that the disease never touched me. I never allowed it to touch me, because he was more than his body. And his body had the cancer, but he wasn't going to have any of it. And it never touched him.
Isn't that beautiful? He probably realized that his wife was still suffering for him when he hadn't even suffered in the way she was suffering for him. Isn't that interesting?
Tremendous. But in our view, we would say, oh, well, he suffered, she suffered. Isn't it awful? Isn't it terrible? Blessed be the name of the Lord forever. So that's a philosophy that doesn't help anyone.
Exactly. And it's so wonderful to know that if we keep our consciousness in present time, we're going with the flow. That's what it actually is. And when we're in present time, we can't be in the past worrying about what's happened. We can't be dreading the future, but present time. And that's what the swimmer was doing when they just relaxed and went with the flow, and then was able to come back to shore.
Very important, but we know that swimmers don't always heed that advice.
That's right.
And of course, as you're being pulled out to sea, it's very hard to kind of close your eyes and relax. But maybe what we need to do is close our eyes and relax.
Exactly, because it's just the same thing as if we get a dread disease. If we're going to fight that disease forever, then just with the cancer, then we're not healing, because we're spending our energy fighting it. If we go with the flow and give up, we've both heard of so many cases of dread illnesses where people have given up, but they haven't given up. They've just gone with it in a positive way.
Right, they've
then
given
it's
in.
behind them. Then it's behind them, and they're healed.
They've given in, and one of the things that we've talked about is the power of going with the flow and not giving up, but giving in to the circumstances and situations of life. And we hope that you found this useful, and we'll see you next time.
Dynamic power helps me be strong. Confident living comforts my heart. From such a blessing I can't depart. Confident living helps me expand visions of value, the kingdom at hand. Confident living, talent to win, gift of the Spirit moves from within. Confident living.